AIDS patients breaking the law in a desperate battle to save their own lives. Has it really come to that? Well, tonight we'll tell you why it has. This week in Washington, medical researchers from around the world have been meeting to share information about AIDS. Among them, a team from San Francisco, which has been monitoring AIDS patients for 7 years. And what the researchers say is that the number of infected Americans who are going to reach the fatal stage of AIDS is 30 times greater than researchers first believed.
Barbara, you said fatal stage, and that's key to our story tonight because it's vital that everyone learn that AIDS usually goes through 3 stages. First, the infection with the AIDS virus, and then ARC, which is AIDS-related complex, and finally, AIDS itself. And this stage is always fatal, so far. But if the right drugs could be found to arrest AIDS in the first or even second stage of its attack, the number of lives saved could be tremendous. It's in the pursuit of such drugs that AIDS patients are forced to take desperate measures. And tonight, Tom Jarrell asks, does it really have to be that way?
Act up, fight back, fight AIDS. Act up, fight back, fight AIDS.
After 7 years of living with the AIDS epidemic and over 20,000 AIDS-related deaths, the gay community, which has suffered the most from the disease, is exploding with rage.
19,000 people are dead. I mean, doesn't anyone seem to realize? I mean, that's incredible. If 19,000 grandmothers or Boy Scouts or 11 Boy Scouts died, we'd go bananas in this country.
They've taken to the streets, rebelling against the slow pace of drug development.
The problem here has been business as usual. And for those of us who wake up every morning and face the possibility that we may die, that's not good enough.
It's genocide. I refuse to accept anything else. It's simple, pure genocide.
Demonstrations like these in New York City and Washington, D.C. reflect a growing anger toward the conventional health regulatory authorities, the Food and Drug Administration, and the National Institutes of Health. The anger is for not adequately developing, testing, and distributing drugs to combat this fearsome epidemic. Emotions seethe over unspent millions of dollars Congress had appropriated to get drugs out to everyone.
$47 million was given to the NIH last June specifically for testing drugs on AIDS patients. They haven't used it for that.
A portion of the money has been spent, but it's easy to understand the frustration. For example, last year, with money appropriated by Congress, the National Institutes of Health set up AIDS treatment evaluation units at 19 medical centers across the country. They had hoped to test half a dozen drugs in 2,000 patients.
But the program has tested only 2 antiviral drugs on just 600 patients.
I think perhaps more was promised than we could be possibly expected to deliver in the time frame that we were given.
Dr. Paul Volberding of San Francisco General Hospital sits on the Drug Selection Committee of the NIH. He says the time spent organizing a plan to test and evaluate the drugs eventually will pay off.
There seems to be the belief that as soon as a drug is shown to be of some value in the laboratory, that it should be immediately released to people without knowing how to give it, what side effects to expect, how best to combine it with other drugs, how to increase its effectiveness. Those are all things that simply take time. The payoff is enormous.
The government agencies have quickly tested and approved one antiviral drug, AZT. It seems to slow down the damage the virus creates. It's the only government-approved AIDS drug in America. But even this most promising of drugs is a source of frustration and anger. At $10,000 a year cost per patient, it's prohibitively expensive for most and not widely available.
What's happening now is that patients are desperate. They will take anything. They'll pop anything into their mouth now. This is the first case, I think, in history where the actual afflicted people are taking control, taking charge of the epidemic.
Across the country, AIDS patients and activists have reached out for unconventional treatments that might prolong lives. They've probed medical research files, set up home laboratories, flown thousands of miles for treatment abroad. Many are now treating themselves with medications that seem hopeful, though not yet approved by the government. Most feel they were forced into these unorthodox measures.
I ran into a situation when I was first diagnosed. I asked the question, what do I do now? And I was told that there was nothing to do. Wait. When I got sick, come back and I would get treated. And that's still happening today, 3.5 years later.
That wasn't good enough for Tom Jefferson of San Francisco. He's been traveling to Mexico to get 2 unapproved drugs, isoprenazine, an immune booster, and ribavirin, an antiviral agent. After making the 600-mile trip from San Francisco to Tijuana, this is what Jefferson must go through in his fight for life. Pay hundreds of dollars for a month's supply, which his insurance does not cover. He must then go through customs at the border. The FDA has instructed customs agents to allow Americans to bring back 1 month's supply only for personal use. More than that's considered smuggling. Jefferson then goes through the same thing the next day, so he'll not have to return to Mexico as often. He's done this for 3 years.
The result? Results have been some very dramatic changes in all of my blood chemistry, from very low counts back into a normal range. My spleen's gone back to normal. The lymphoma that I was diagnosed as having has gone into a state of remission. There is no evidence.
Jefferson certainly doesn't think of himself as cured, but he attributes his improvement to his decision to sidestep the system and take individual action.
Had you been a so-called good boy and followed the accepted methods of treatment at that time, where would you be today?
I'd probably be dead.
Project Inform, may I help you?
In San Francisco, Jefferson is the administrator of Project Inform, a vital source of information which tries to protect desperate people against the dangers of quackery, while alerting them to promising new drugs which have not yet been given years of government testing.
In the meantime, we have a packet of information on ribavirin and isoprenazine and 4 other experimental drugs that are being used currently with varying degrees of success for the treatment of AIDS and ARDS.
They endorse no treatment or product, but they do tell people what's available and how to buy it, make it, or use it.
With the number of people that are dying and the rate they're dying, everyone cannot wait for absolute certainty. What we try to do is to take some of the risk and uncertainty out of it for people who are willing to reach out to unproven remedies.
Project Inform's philosophy is that people at risk for AIDS need to be tested for the virus. But a nagging source of fear for so many people who are infected is that the AIDS virus can be slowly killing their immune system without any visible sign. One way to know if the virus is progressing is regular testing of a special group of white cells in the blood. They are called T helper cells, critical to the immune system and prime targets for the deadly AIDS virus. Normally, our T helper count is around 1,000. A count of less than 500 in a person positive for the AIDS virus is a sign the virus is progressing. At this early stage, intervention might be most helpful.
But with no FDA-approved drugs for early intervention, most doctors have been reluctant to recommend treatment until there are clinical signs of disease. But that's beginning to change.
In 1985, Dr. Barry Gingell went to Mexico to smuggle ribavirin into the United States. It was reported he brought it in for his patients. It wasn't reported that the doctor himself had AIDS and was also taking the drug.
I had no choice. I waited for a year to go on experimental drug protocols that never happened, and I knew what was happening inside my body, and I had no choice.
Dr. Gingell believes that ribavirin bought him time. He's discontinued it now in favor of AZT, the government-approved drug. He continues to research and use alternative therapies against his illness. And he campaigns vigorously for faster drug development and early intervention for other patients.
It's often a matter of weeks or months that a patient goes from ARC to full-blown AIDS, and the vast majority of them do. The time to intervene is clearly when a patient has ARC, when there's a certain amount of the immune system that's still left.
I've seen people that were healthy 1 week die the next week, and it's scary.
28-year-old Ken Neese seems perfectly healthy, but he told me he has carried the AIDS virus for 2 years, and his T cells are now starting to drop.
My attitude has gone through the denial process, through acceptance, through the step that I'm taking now, and that's intervention and taking charge of my life.
So, with no drugs available for him in this country, he too has started his pilgrimage to Mexico for ribavirin. But the question remains, can't a person harm himself taking unapproved, unprescribed drugs?
The potential for harm does exist, and patients should find a compassionate doctor who is willing, who knows about the drugs and knows what to expect and knows the toxicities and is willing to monitor a patient. They should not do it themselves.
The manufacturer of ribavirin, ICN, insists the drug seems safe and has presented studies which indicate the drug does delay progression of the AIDS virus.
I do.
Testimony on the drug was presented at a House Oversight Committee hearing. Witnesses charged the company's data was biased and that the drug might even be harmful to patients with advanced disease. The company stands by the drug and their studies, but the FDA is not convinced it's effective and has yet to approve it.
But when a drug's safety and effectiveness has been proven, a new FDA ruling promises to speed it to needy patients, but only then if their condition is terminal.
This would cut that process in half, so it could shave 2.5 to 3 years off the time in which American people can get drugs for immediately life-threatening and serious illnesses when there is no alternative therapy.
For people in Ken's condition, that is healthy but carrying a time bomb, this new ruling will do no good. Any early intervention Ken wants to do must be done on his own. Desperation sent symphonic conductor and pianist Michael May halfway around the world to the Weizmann Institute in Israel to try a new drug called AL-721.
I was dying, and I was feverish, I was delirious, I could hardly walk, I had to be carried in by a friend. I went in a wheelchair. But it turned out that I did recover. My symptoms went away. And when I came home from Israel, I didn't need a wheelchair. And that was only 4 weeks later.
Spread it on your bread.
AL-721 is made from egg yolks. May spreads it on bread like butter and eats it every morning for breakfast. It wasn't available in the United States, but when word of the drug's apparent success got out, home recipes for the drug were distributed to patients who started manufacturing it in their own kitchens.
So here you go. Thank you.
Last month, the People with AIDS Health Group, an AIDS activist organization in New York City, took matters into their own hands. Disregarding a patent on AL-721, they brought in a refrigerated truck holding $20,000 worth of a generic copy of the drug for AIDS patients all across the country. They distributed it at the Judson Church in Greenwich Village.
Thanks, you saved my life.
I need this drug. Is it illegal? Who cares?
Almost 2 years ago, Dr. Robert Gallo, the NIH's top researcher on AIDS, wrote about AL-721 in a letter to the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine. He wrote AL-721 was a promising new candidate for clinical investigation in the treatment of AIDS and AIDS-related complex. But it should be emphasized that the results so far are very preliminary and that much more work will be required to determine the clinical usefulness of this agent. Even with this kind of interest from the government's top AIDS researcher, AL-721 has yet to be tested in government trials.
I'm a little angry. I want this stuff. I want it now.
Despite the growing use of unapproved AIDS drugs, no one is claiming any of these remedies is a cure for any of the stages of AIDS. Nor can one be sure of what dangerous side effects any experimental drugs might bring. But there is no doubt that many of the afflicted will continue to risk whatever health they have left looking for cures until an effective therapy is found.
Why are drugs still sitting on the shelf? We've learned a lot about this disease in 5 years. The numbers now are staggering, and the numbers for the future are just unbelievable, but they will occur unless we do something now.
Tom, this situation is so desperate. I think perhaps we should just emphasize again what we've been talking about in this piece. That is, will these drugs work, and why aren't people able to get them here?
Barbara, every drug we've mentioned in this report seems to have some positive effect in some of the patients who have used them. Again, we are not endorsing these drugs, but most seem to have positive effects.
And why can't people get them now?
Well, again, the FDA, in order to approve these, has to be very cautious. You can't let a drug loose that you don't know all the side effects. Remember thalidomide. We thought that was a safe drug, but it wound up having terrible side effects.
So there's hope, but we're not there yet, and let's hope we're there soon.
Desperate search by a lot of people.
Thank you, Tom.